Please welcome to the stage David Hart, Andrew Wiggins, and Joe Clements.
Hello, everybody. What could be more fun than having some chicken and talking about politics in Florida, right? So we got a clicker issue. How many of you remember this famous night, election 2000, with the late, great Tim Russert? Florida, Florida, Florida. Well, that night, the election was decided in Florida after many, many weeks by just 537 votes. But I would tell you that if the late, great Tim Russert were with us today, he would tell you that Florida is even more important in this presidential cycle than it was in 2000. And the reason is on that night, Florida had 25 electoral votes. We now have 29. This chart will show you from 2000 to 2016 the outcome of the presidential elections in Florida. We've always been a battleground. We've always been a very close battleground. And as I mentioned on that night in 2000, Florida was decided by just 537 votes. But we've continued to be a very tight battleground through many cycles, often being under 1% of the vote, as we were in 2012 when Obama defeated Romney in Florida. And in 2016, we were just over 1% of the vote when Trump defeated Hillary Clinton in Florida. To be clear, Florida has been the predictor in the presidential run every election cycle except one since 1964. But we've also been incredibly expensive, no surprise to any of you, getting more expensive all the time. In 2016, in the light blue there, you see how much was spent in our U.S. Senate race. In the dark blue, you see that over $200 million was spent in the presidential in Florida, as best we can estimate, and over $500 million collectively on all the races combined. But watch this in 2018. In 2018, we had the most expensive U.S. Senate race and the most expensive gubernatorial race in the country, and likely in the history of the Republic. And as you can see there on the bottom, if you added up all the races that were going on in Florida, federal, state, et cetera, over how much is that? $1 billion were spent. So one bit of an anomaly is going on this cycle that you don't see very often. We don't have a governor and cabinet cycle going on in 2020. We don't have a U.S. Senate race on the ballot, and so there are no statewide races on the Florida ballot this November, with the exception of presidential and whatever constitutional amendments make the ballot. If you hadn't heard, there are 24 different proposed constitutional amendments currently somewhere in the process, and 9 of them have already gathered enough signatures to be moving forward to Attorney General and Supreme Court review, and 1 has already actually gained a place on the ballot. And so one of the themes we'll be talking about is these constitutional amendments could be driving certain segment of voters to the polls, and will that have any impact on the presidential race in Florida? This is a snapshot that I won't leave up long enough for you to read everything on it, but this is what's at stake in Florida for the business community in 2020 and for the 3 cycles beyond, whether that be House and Senate races at the state level, whether that be 2022, where we've got governor and cabinet back up, or we've also got redistricting coming up in 2022, which will impact every cycle after that. And then, of course, additionally, whatever constitutional amendment should make the ballot each of those coming years. I wanted to give you a sense of what was at stake for all of us for this reason. Our friend Speaker Weatherford's long been telling us that we won't get the policies right in Florida unless we get the politics right. And what he means by that is we have to win races. We have to elect men and women to the Florida House, to the Florida Senate, to our congressional delegation that believe what we believe and want to improve Florida's business climate and stand up for free enterprise. And so with Will's quote in mind, one of the things you'll hear a lot about over the next year is we have launched the new Florida Chamber Free Enterprise Fund. And our goal is the pursuit of 125 new companies that will join the Free Enterprise Fund and invest $10,000 in that fund each year to help support the right candidates for office. I'm now going to ask Andrew Wiggins to talk about some of what's at stake in 2020 in some key House and state Senate races. Andrew?
Thank you, David. Taking a quick look at 2020, we know that in Florida, redistricting matters and term limits matter. So when we look at what's going on in 2020, what the map lays out is mostly where people were members of the legislature have been term limited. And we know right now that we have 25 members of the House will be leaving us, 7 members of the Senate. Some members are leaving early. As term limits have evolved, we see that a lot of times members will look to local races when they open up to give them an opportunity to run for higher offices, and that opens up opportunities, or it presents difficulties in replacing members of the legislature that have been good for the business community. Quickly looking at the Florida Senate, we see that there are 9 open seats, but what really is in play is the balance of power in those state Senate will be determined by 2 seats. Republicans would still have a majority, but right now the 2 seats in play are only Republican seats. In Senate District 9 in the Orlando area where we are now, David Simmons' seat is open, and that is one that's in play, and both sides are competing very heavily against, as well as in Senate District 39 in Miami, which is probably will be the most competitive seat in the state this time, with Anatoly Flores' seat opening up and having 2 members of the House deciding they're running for it. Javier Fernandez as a Democrat and Ana Maria Rodriguez as a Republican. So looking at the map and looking at the Senate, we know that there's of the races to play, there are 2 that are ones that will be battleground contests. Moving to the House, we see much more opportunity and much more of a battleground. You know, the yellow stars sort of show you all around the state, and if you look where the yellow stars are and where we see the seats that are most in play, they're in the Miami area that are in Republican-held seats, as well as the I-4 corridor. During the 2018 election, some seats flipped due to increased turnout on the Democratic side. Those seats will be in play this time. Some of them in play because members of the House have decided to run for Congress, having picked up these seats. So we see that there'll be, for instance, Adam Hattersley in Tampa Bay is now running against Ross Spanier for Congress, as well as Margaret Good in Sarasota running for Congress against Vern Buchanan, our former chairman. So looking at the map, we know that there will be houses in play, and both sides will have to defend it. And with Florida being so important, I like to say that Florida is the purplest of purple states or the swingiest of swing states because we matter the most. If a Republican can win Florida, the White House is in play. If they don't win Florida, it's very, very difficult to move forward. Moving on, what we look at, we know that in March we'll have our presidential primary. Then qualifying will happen for federal offices in May, then for the state offices in June, and then in the middle of August, the earliest we've had it, we'll have our primary and then rolling to the general election in November. I'd like to turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Andrew. I need the clicker. Thank you. So 2.5-minute macro factor blitz here on what's influencing Florida elections. We'll get started with the NPA. So one of the ironies of modern politics is that as partisanship is at an all-time high, party affiliation is at an all-time low. And so you see this chart, and we're hitting a tipping point with NPAs. They're approaching that 30% of the total electorate mark, and we have closed primaries in Florida. That could be changing. There's an amendment on the ballot this year, the jungle primary, so-called, to change it and allow NPAs to vote in our primary system. Second is when the Trump campaign launched a few months ago in Orlando, just up the road here at Amway, Major Garrett did an interview with campaign manager Brad Parscale, who said, we don't think people can accurately poll us because we've identified hundreds of thousands of voters throughout the country who didn't vote in 2016, but we know they'll vote for us now because they've given money, they've joined our email list, or they've come to an event. So we did an analysis of Florida where we looked at 30-plus-year-old white males who are registered Republicans and NPAs. And where did they not vote in 2016? And so what you see here is the percentage of no-shows of that group. So don't be surprised if you see President Trump spending more time in Southeast Florida than you think he might, given that it's a Democratic hotbed, or even up in Northwest Florida because of the concentration of people, of white males over 30 who did not vote in 2016. So third, if you remember back to Obama 2008, that the demographics of the state were going to make it impossible to win for Republicans going forward, well, that changed a little bit, right? And why did that change? It's the demographics of the state are safely NPA and Democratic. And if you look at the younger bars at the top here, you'll see that. But Florida also imports a lot of voters. We tend to grow our own. We grow them as NPA or Democrat. When we import voters, we tend to import a lot of Republican voters, and those are going to be those 50, 60-plus voters down there. So as long as the economy stays good and people feel like Florida's a great place to go, the state's going to remain competitive. Then we have constitutional ballot amendments. This is how many have been proposed, light blue, how many passed, dark blue. It's about 22 of 36, a 58% passage rate. Now that 2012 is a little misleading. The legislature put several amendments on the ballot that were rejected by voters, but by and large, when public amendments make the ballot, they tend to pass. And so this is a knife that cuts two ways. One is it can increase turnout in a lower turnout election, but if you have a higher turnout election, you can get a lot of anti-status quo type amendments passed in the higher turnout races. Number 5 is impacts of Michael. What you see here, this is the Trump margin in 2016 in each of these Michael impacted counties. This equals about 64,000 votes plus for Trump in the Panhandle counties. And so is the rebuild coming along? Are people happy with what the administration's done in the Panhandle? How many people left the Panhandle since the storm came through? Remember, Trump only won the state by about 117,000 votes, so there has to be margin for a Republican everywhere they can get it in order to win. So how's the Michael recovery coming? In another part of the state, we looked at Hispanic voters registered in Orange and Osceola County since October 2017 to see if we could find evidence of Puerto Rican voters moving to Florida and registering. It's really hard to tease out of this data right now, and our best guess is if the Puerto Ricans who've relocated here do register, they probably haven't registered yet. You'll probably see them pushed in voting drives later on in the cycle. Now, I'm going to kick it back over to David to finish us off here.
Joe, Andrew, thank you for your analysis. The final statement I want to share with the audience is, can you advance the slide, Joe? Is as Floridians, look, everybody cares about our state. I think we've made that case clear, but no one should care more about Florida than we do in this room and our fellow Floridians across the state. And so if you care about the outcomes, be it constitutional amendments, be it some of the key House and Senate races that Andrew pointed out, I'm going to ask you to find any one of the three of us or find Mark before this conference is over and join us in investing in the Free Enterprise Fund, and let's make sure we continue to get the right outcomes for our state. Thank you very much.